Today we're going to do an installation guide on swapping out the intake manifold off of a 2013 Genesis Coupe 2-liter turbo with a previous generation intake manifold that's also been ported and polished by Grimmspeed. I opted to get the ceramic paint added to it for thermal purposes and just to make it look better. You also want to get the forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce it, but either phenolic spacer for sandwiching the gaskets, sandwiching the spacer in between the gaskets for better installation. And just for fun, I went ahead and got another gasket for the throttle body just in case we're gonna need it. So two intake manifold gaskets, one spacer, intake manifold, and here just to show you a little bit, it's been ported and polished by Grimmspeed. They did a great job. Fantastic looking intake manifold. And we're gonna swap out our stock plastic one here that comes on the 2013 for that one. So we're just letting the engine cool down a little bit before we get started. Step is remove the negative terminal on the battery. Now our installation is going to deviate a little bit from the instructions on the Hyundai website, but that's just because we're experimenting and we're trying to see if we can find any shortcuts. So right now we're going to disconnect the intercooler hose. So we just snap the caps off and you'll find the screws underneath. Loosen the clamps and then just pull the hose off. Disconnect the electrical connector that attached to the throttle body. Now we're going to try to do this installation without disconnecting any of the water lines, so we'll see if this is going to be successful. So just stick around with the video and we'll let you know. Now unbolt the intake manifold, the throttle body off the intake manifold, and we're going to move it off to the side. There are 4 bolts there on the 4 corners. Well, it's circular, but you'll see what I mean when there's 4 corners. You can see 2 of them there. The picture one there and there. We'll disconnect the PCV hose off of the crankcase and the intake manifold. Disconnecting the other vacuum lines. This is another vacuum boost line coming off the intake manifold. Next, disconnect the fuel line, fuel regulator piece off the intake manifold. Beware, it will release a little bit of fuel. I can already smell it. And just put the hose off to the side. We're going to remove the bolt that's holding the water line for the main radiator hose, the upper hose. driver's side. This is just the mounting bolt. We're going to try to see if we can get away with not removing the water line at all. We're disconnecting the some type of a boost solenoid line is attached here on the top of the intake manifold. We're just going to remove the hose itself, and then there's two supporting bolts right here for the mechanism that we're going to unbolt, and then we're just going to move the entire thing over to the side. To the side and just keep it out of the way. Now we're going to disconnect another sensor over here in the back of the intake manifold. Pretty much disconnect the connector and remove the sensor. Actually, you don't even need to remove the connector because we're just going to reattach it over. It just mounts up over to the intake manifold. I don't think it's even connected to anything in the intake manifold itself. No, it's not. Okay, so just remove the bolt and move it to the side. Removing another on the automatic, it's going to have this extra vacuum pump line that goes all the way down to the vacuum pump down here. The manuals do not have this line, so if you don't see this and you have a 6-speed, that's fine. You're perfectly fine. So we're just disconnecting a few more vacuum boost lines.
Map sensor.
Next, we remove the connector for the map sensor over on the top. That's the map sensor right here. We'll remove the connector. Next we're going to remove the fuel rail, and it's only held by 2 bolts. One of the bolts is one of the bolts is right here, and the other one is going to be right there. Just remove them and safely and gently pull it out straight up because the fuel injectors are connected to it and you don't want to break anything. Both sides and pull straight up. You have to be patient and work it a little bit, but you'll be able to get it. It would also help to remove the oil dipstick out of the way, just to give you a little bit more working room. And when the engine is cooled down, you don't have to worry about spilling a little bit of gas on it. Everything's going to be fine. It's just going to pop. Lift.
Maybe I can leave it there. I need to disconnect it.
You want to just leave it there? Maybe it's safer, just disconnect it, it's okay. The electric. Well, if it's too much trouble, then it's okay.
No, it's okay. This way you can disconnect.
What we're thinking is that it's possible to leave the electrical connectors on the fuel injectors. However, and just move it over to the side. However, we may just disconnect it. I don't know. We're still contemplating. If you want to just leave it, just leave it. Just leave it. It's okay.
No, okay.
We'll get right back to you. It's a little extra working room. We're going to take off the cover. Mine is red, just because mine is special. Just kidding. I painted it, so it's fine. It's not out of the factory that way. Anyway, we're going to remove the spark plug cover. I think we may just keep everything electrically connected, but just moved over to the side nicely. That way we just don't have to worry about doing too much and putting it back. Again, we're trying to find shortcuts to show how this can be a pretty easy swap. You know, we may run into some snags on the way, but we'll summarize as we go along.
I think I need to take it out of that one.
Yes, for the oil dipstick, you do have to remove it, or just move it out of the way, because that one bolt is going to be pretty tough to get at. The bolt right there, so that's for the oil dipstick hole. We're going to need to move that out of the way. But as you can see, there's a lot of working room now. Oh, and we disconnected one more sensor back here, just to, I don't know if it shows, but just to give us a little bit more room, and then we moved the entire fuel rail with the fuel injectors out of the way. One supporting bracket that's on the far driver's side on the outside. You can see it's located right in there. And this is the bracket. I believe it may support the water pipe, I'm not sure. Anyway, disconnect that one. At this point, we're going to lift the car up because we need to continue from the bottom of the intake manifold. In your case, if you don't have a car lift, either you jack the car up, put it on stands and get underneath it, or you go to a nice mechanic shop like I did and get the car on the lift. Well, of course, you'd have to do that before you start all this, not at this particular point, but you get the idea. Just a little bit more footage of the stock plastic intake manifolds. See with the light from underneath, there's a few supporting bolts that we're going to have to remove. You can see a couple right there and a third one in the top right corner where the light was shining. So there's 3. And also make it easier to access the bottom bolts of the intake manifold itself, which I'll show you when we get to that point. Good footage of this, but right now we're taking off the oil dipstick tube. There's one single bolt right in front of the motor mount on the driver's side that you just need to unbolt off. It's easier done from under the car, but again, I can't quite get a good footage of this, but you can kind of get an idea of where we're positioned here. And once you remove that bolt, then you can move the dipstick tube out of the way so that you can have access to the top bolts. But be sure while you're under here, go ahead and remove the other bolts from the bottom of the intake manifold. Once you get the bolt now, it's just a matter of working it upwards and it just pops right off. Now you can see where how it's positioned inside the car in this manner. So you just remove the bolt and just pull straight up. I'm just going to look over to the side. Okay, now we're removing another supporting vacuum line bolt here. It's not one of the many vacuum lines that this engine has, so we're just removing that to disconnect it from the intake manifold. And then we're going to one more. Is there another bolt on the bottom?
Yes.
Okay, looks like there's another bolt on the bottom when you follow your hand in where that metal line goes. Once you locate the bolt, remove that. It's one of the hard lines that then turns into a rubber line. I don't know if it'll make out on the camera, but it's that gray line down here where my finger was pointing. It's the same one. So it's all the same line. You're going to disconnect the rubber line once you pull it out. You can kind of see the corner of the bolt. It's this shiny piece right in the middle of my finger where the line goes into. That's the bolt, and it actually goes upwards into the intake manifold. I think it may be easier to ignore this one for now and just go ahead and proceed taking the bolts off the intake manifold now from the top side and the bottom. Whatever you didn't get to from the bottom. Once you take the entire intake manifold off, then you can turn it upside down and remove the other part line. We'll get to that in a second. Looks like we found another shortcut that it would be easier to take the bottom bolts of the intake manifold that connect over to the block from the top end by these crevices over here and over here. And then the top ones clearly are accessible from the top. I don't have good light, so I can't really show it to you, but they're there. I really misspoke a moment ago. Those crevices are to access the top bolts, not the bottom ones. So you still want to go ahead and lift the car up or get underneath to remove the other bolts from the bottom end. We're removing the bolts from the bottom. There should be 3 bolts on the bottom and 2 on the top. Since I can't get good footage here this way, I will show you on the second intake manifold where those bolts would be, in case you didn't catch it initially. Just to show you that the intake manifold that we're going to put on, you have the 2 bolts here in the middle for the top and 3 at the bottom, 2 on each corner, 1 in the middle. So that's your reference points for taking the old one out. Thing I want to mention to you is that we also removed one of the brackets. There's 2 of these. They're a little bit different from each other underneath the intake manifold, and so we're working to remove those because it'll make it a lot easier to take the intake manifold out. In addition to that, the cable to the starter needs to be moved out of the way just so you can access the bolts. I can't show any footage of that because there's no space. You can't really get the camera in there. But when you go in there, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Just slide the intake manifold off straight, right when you get the bolts off. Very easy. Now, it's a couple of things that we're going to have to move over to the other one, like the map sensor here. In my case, I need to move this one-way check valve because the original one didn't come with one, and then you want to move this hose down here with the metallic line as well to transfer it over to the new one. So here's some footage of how the motor looks without the intake manifold. The thing that you're going to need to add that's not included is let's see if I can focus, 1/8 to 5/16 hose fitting, and this is for one of the boost and vacuum hoses, sorry, because on the original plastic one it's built in right here, you cannot take this off, whereas on the older one it's a bolt-in style, so you need to go ahead and apply one in there. Just get one at this size, put some Teflon tape, and then go ahead and attach it. Applying the gaskets, put the original OEM gasket first, then the spacer, and then another gasket. Because you have to make a seal on both, on the engine block and the intake manifold. Okay. Mentioned earlier on the 6-speed intake manifold, you're going to have this extra port. If you have an automatic, you need to go ahead and plug this up. However, if you get a manifold from an automatic, you will not have this port, so be sure when you're buying this that you match up 6-speed to 6-speed, but you can put a 6-speed to a manual, to an automatic car, and it'll be fine. So just go ahead and find the right size bolt, put some Teflon, and tighten it up. Now we're going to go ahead and get the intake manifold fitted back in, the new one, the replacement. Turns out that we do have to remove the water line, water pipe here that goes to the upper radiator hose, because the corner of the intake manifold will not clear this bend. So remove the bolts, just move it just a little bit. You're going to have to put a pan to catch some of the water, hopefully, or antifreeze rather. And I brought some extra antifreeze in case we did need to do this, so be sure to catch that. And use the original antifreeze. Well, in the bottle, the brand new in the bottle here from Hyundai, so that you don't mix and match the coolant. That's what's most preferred. So we went ahead and did that, and we got it to fit in. You can see even the studs come out with no problem, so that you can put the bolts even with the spacers. Be sure to use the supplied bolts here for when you have the phenolic spacer installed, because the extension is going to sit out a little bit further and you need something that's going to reach when you mount it back. Start off by putting the nuts on the top section, the top two built-in studs, and then install these on the bottom end. Mention that these mounting brackets from the bottom, just like this black one I'm shining my light to, are not going to match up between the 2013 locations and the previous generation intake manifold. I think the best thing to do in this situation is you can actually leave them off, but what we're going to see is the one over there on that stud that's sticking out. We're going to see if putting the bracket there at least allows for it to rest onto the, cause the intake manifold to rest on the bracket, but let's see if that's going to work out. Now, I wanted to show you that this hose on the bottom end of the original plastic has a hard line and then a soft line that goes to some kind of reservoir here. Now, on the older intake manifolds, it's a little bit different. They don't have these mounting ports, and it actually starts to come off from somewhere around here. So what I did instead is match up the size of the hose and just take a rubber hose all the way from here, all the way to the hard section that sits at the motor, which is right here. And just get it matched up and connected, and then reattach the supporting bolts. Tightened up the intake manifold onto the block. Go ahead and re-tighten and reconnect the water line, the water pipe to the back of the block. And then attach the supporting bracket onto the intake manifold. Now go ahead and get your fuel rail positioned and connected back into the intake manifold. Seat them, snugly, and then press down so that all four injectors pop into place. Don't force it. If you're giving a little bit of tension as you're pushing it down on both sides simultaneously, and it's not going in, pull it back out. Try again, because you don't want to force these things. You can go ahead and add a little bit of grease on the O-rings just to make them seat in, but be careful not to get any grease on the actual nozzle of the fuel injectors. but this will help slide the injectors into their corresponding ports. Once you get it put in, one thing you're going to notice is that you're going to have a gap between where the fuel rail bolt is and where it actually meets here. In order to correct this issue, just get a stack of about 12 washers for the correct size and line up the bolt in through with all 12 washers so that you can fill in the gap. In my situation, I have these handmade stack of washers that have been heat shrink with heat shrink tubing. A member of the Hyundai forums did this for me, and I really appreciate him putting this together. So it makes for a thick washer or spacer that we're going to actually sandwich in there and then put the bolts inside. But however, if you do not put the heat shrink tubing, it's perfectly fine. You can just stack about I believe he said it was 12 washers, but you know, depending on the thickness of the washers, you're going to see which one's actually going to be the correct amount of washers that you're going to stack, just so that you can fill in the gap. And then insert the bolts and tighten. And then tighten with a wrench. Now you can reattach some of the sensors, the map sensor and the other connectors that you disconnected. Start to put together the vacuum lines, boost lines, where they belong. Install your throttle body studs. They come with your kit. Whether you get the phenolic spacer or not is irrelevant, but it will come with the kit. And those, you want to put it as indicated with the longer threads at the tips, the smaller threads inside the intake manifold, compared with the original. Install the gasket for the throttle body, and then the throttle body. And then reattach all the 4 bolts, 2 nuts and 2 bolts onto the throttle body, and plug the connector in for your actual throttle plate. Intercooler pipe into the throttle body. Tighten the necessary clamps. Reattach the boost solenoid hose assembly and attach the 2 bolt mounting bolts that support onto the intake manifold. And this line right here with the check valve, that's the boost solenoid assembly. The actual solenoid is right here. And be sure to put your clamps and everything back in. And then next you want to go ahead and connect the PCV line back. PCV hose onto the PCV valve and hose clamp. Next you want to go ahead and reattach your boost vacuum line. And put the proper hose clamps. And also your your vacuum pump line. Again, this is only on the automatics. The 6-speed do not have this. Then go ahead and attach the fuel pressure regulator back onto your fuel rail and attach with the necessary bolts. When you set it in there, go ahead and push down on it so it can pop into place. And then reattach the spark plug cover as one of the nearing final steps. The only thing left after this, check all the connections, make sure everything is good, zip tie whatever you need to zip tie, get things out of the way, make sure all the hose clamps, everything is right where it needs to be, and go ahead and refill back the coolant into your radiator and bleed as necessary. Final thing to go ahead and take care of is don't forget to put in the oil dipstick tube back. Shouldn't have too much trouble getting it back in. Just slide it in from the top to get it inserted in the correct location on the engine block, and then from underneath the car install the bolt. Thing is put all back together and you start it up. Go ahead and refill back the coolant and use some kind of a funnel apparatus so that you can bleed and get all the air bubbles out of it. And just slowly take your time, everything will be good. And that would conclude swapping out the intake manifold on a 2013 Genesis Coupe 2.0 turbo.